Somebody's got the AC on already?
Yep, me.
Didn't write down that.
We're gonna do our meeting when we pull out on the way with Jackie.
We all need city comfies or the, whatever.
We
No, we're here
gave us
to
those
talk
blankets,
about
we were talking
budget.
about keeping those, I wish you could hold blankets, everybody could pull on the blanket.
I missed that.
Okay, are we,
You know we're here to
okay.
talk about budget.
Welcome to our special city council meeting. One agenda item, so we're gonna turn it over to Nathan to start.
Alright, are we actually projecting? Does Steve have it? Okay. So briefly, we did a biennial budget, so we're in the middle, this isn't in theory, it was not a full rebuild when we did this, but there are some things we'll talk about today, so Kyle has done a tremendous amount of work, to put this together and go through trying to understand certain assumptions and why they were made and what we're doing with that. And so I just wanted to, recognize him before he takes over, and also, it's the first finance director I've worked with who really is comfortable talking to council. Usually they make me do it, so I'm happy to have that. We'll probably tag team with, Wendy was in yesterday as we went through this, so primarily it will be Kyle, but we'll jump in as we talk about some, primarily as we get down to maybe some different budgeting philosophies and different approaches, how we maybe historically have done budgeting in this city and what we need to modernize a bit of our process.
Great, thank you, Nathan.
And hopefully it's working.
Okay, turned it on. So, there we go.
Alright.
So, as you know, I sent out the electronic packet yesterday, so you do have the slides if you want to take notes on paper about the electronic version. So I've tried to break this into sections to reduce the monotony, although I could probably spend 2 hours and drone on and on about the budget, but I did try to break it up into different chunks.
And real quick, remember, we're gonna try and give you a bunch of information, and we don't expect you to solve problems or
Ask that.
we want, it is scheduled for your next work meeting, you have this on there, we schedule it again if needed, to give you some time to listen today, think about it. If you have questions, certainly we can answer them, but, we don't intend you to make final decisions today, but really, this is an information, Kyle is not
Information
going to.
download.
Yeah, it was gonna be a download, we're gonna give you a bunch of information and then allow you to synthesize it and come back.
So as Nathan had mentioned, and as I'm sure you all know, you had passed a biennial budget last year. You thought you were done with this for 2 years. However, in that past year, there's been a few assumptions that were made with the budget that have changed. And we're just gonna go through some of these quickly. The first one is, as you probably know, because I mentioned it many times, is the State Auditor's Office issued an auditor alert, and that alert directed us that any revenue we have in excess of development-related expenses, so development-related revenue less development-related expenses, has to be restricted for development-related expense. So that's one thing that's changing with the budget. Another thing is I think a lot of us thought that the inflation would subside by now or be less than what it is, but we're still facing a high inflation environment. There's been some previous key assumptions that were used in the budget that have changed, mainly what percentage growth rate we would have on certain things, especially property tax. And as I started, new eyes, new perspectives, delving more into the police department budget and how it was structured, this also goes back to the key assumptions. There were some concerns with some of the forecasts made on their revenue projections. And then also water and stormwater. Water especially has faced the inflationary pressures, yet our last rate study was assuming a low inflation environment and didn't contemplate that there'd be a number of capital projects that impact fees couldn't fund. In addition, stormwater, we're gonna get into water and stormwater a little bit later. Stormwater faces some of the same things. And then finally, after I looked at all of the budgets for 24, I was projecting deficits in the general fund and then the police services fund, which that's the part that's funded by the HCSEA property tax. So with that, we're going to delve first into one of the largest components of our budget is personnel. I'm trying to refrain from using these tables, but sometimes they do come in handy. So the top line shows if we were to change nothing, we were offered no raises, no insurance increases, what our total personnel budget would be. However, one thing we did find is we've been utilizing our insurance a lot more than in past years, so our initial renewal came back at 19%. Through the broker and some other changes we're looking at making to the insurance, it's around 7.5, it's a little less than that. Those aren't set yet, so for that, we were able to get that number down. In addition,
What percentage did you budget?
that is
That's one
another,
of your key assumptions.
yes, so I did not have backup to the budget numbers, and when I backed into it, I really couldn't figure out what was budgeted for the increase. They were kind of all over the place depending on the department.
Sorry,
So in the past, we lumped everything as burden, and Kyle, which I fully support, we're breaking that out because the parts of those grow at different rates. And by lumping them all together, it kind of masks what's happening.
sorry.
No, thank you. Questions are great, so feel free to interrupt as I go along. In addition, we've got another slide on this, but there's a number of market adjustments that are being proposed. A lot of that is due to the increase we offered last year relative to what other cities offered. And then a normal COLA step increase. It seems the terminology is interchangeable here. Sometimes it's called a market adjustment, sometimes it's called a COLA. I'm calling it a COLA because the proposal is to raise all of the ranges within the pay scale. So as you can see at the very bottom, overall, it actually shows based off the budget, we're actually saving a little bit of money. However, you'll notice within the individual funds, some are showing deficits versus positive. In particular, water, Nathan's actually the one that did a lot of the legwork on this. We had found a number of positions had not been budgeted correctly. And police is interesting because the personnel side looks fine, but it was the benefits number that actually threw them over on that one, so that one was a little odd. And once again, I don't have good data on how the numbers were derived for the budget. So as promised, on the personnel market adjustments, there's a proposal for 78 employees. And then I believe it is tab 3 on the hard copy will show you detail on the proposals being made by HR. The majority of them are in public works, so it's the outdoor employees primarily. And while there's a number of reasons for these adjustments, last year we did a 4% overall increase, which was lower than the inflation of 7%. And then in addition, a lot of cities made aggressive adjustments, including our neighbor to the north, which I think affected why those market adjustments are necessary. Finally, this bottom chart just shows CPI relative to the increases we've done in the past. So I had HR pull the past 4 years, and as you can see, normally we were offering raises a couple percentage points above inflation. However, in our 2023 was the opposite. We had offered a 4%, inflation was at 7%. The recommendation this year would be to match CPI and the increase, and that's what were in the numbers that were earlier.
Are those public work employees seasonal, or is it just because we're bringing up to right pay scale or grade?
It's the permanent, so it is matching what other cities are offering.
Yeah, it's what essentially is happening in that market is they're able to command a little bit more than inflation is driving.
It's one of those very tight markets. As a aside, the last city I worked at one point, 75% of our outdoor positions were open because we were having such a hard time.
Filling those.
Yeah.
And are we having that same problem?
I don't believe so. We've got a few openings,
Their
but
Their
it's gotten much. The turnover's gotten much better since I started it, especially being over payroll. It seemed like every payroll I was processing 2 or 3 terminations, and now we're maybe seeing one or two a month.
Definite, that last summer was rough.
Yeah.
Last summer, we were losing a lot to, Rocky Mountain Power, Dominion Energy,
Rio
Kennecott,
Tinto.
yeah, Rio Tinto, so we were losing a lot of our CDL drivers. And we traditionally grabbed the CPI at the end of the year, right? So what was the year? And so it's the same one that URS uses. So last year we were 4%, and then by the time budgets were coming around, it was actually 6.5%, and a lot of our sister cities jumped to that higher rate. Over time, it should all balance out, but yeah, I think that's one of our challenges. Is we still, I think it's good budget discipline to pick a date that you use the CPI every year if you're gonna use that, just because it does average out and you're not chasing higher numbers, but we've also seen quite a few mid-cycle increases in cities.
So your market analysis, is that all you're doing for market analysis is just using the CPI index? Or what do you mean your
No.
market?
No.
Who conducts the market analysis?
Travis does.
And so can we, get a copy of that too, so we just understand?
We can also curtail that a little bit by culture, right?
Yeah, you don't have to chase you don't have to be exact, and we still wouldn't be at the top.
Yeah, we're still not at the top.
Where's your target?
So historically, I think they've tried to be in the top third. I think generally you wanna be in that between 50th and 80th percentile, right? You don't wanna be the lowest, because you lose your employees. You don't need to be the highest. Typically, if you're paying at the highest because you have other issues. So that would be the target. It's actually we're working on a bunch of financial policies, and in a lot of places, council will set kind of a payment or a pay plan philosophy.
Yeah.
Not necessarily what the rates are, but the philosophy, and that would actually be a good one for us. There's a lot of policies to put together that we're still working on, but that's, as we're talking, that would actually be a good one.
Yeah, cause I know on some of the other boards I serve on, it's very detailed, it's like, we start here, it's at 50%, here's how you climb, those kind of things, I was just
And
curious if you have.
We have that in our ranges, but if you're talking about an overall philosophy, where do we wanna be in a market? And the market for outdoor employees, and even within that, say for water employees with certifications is different than it might be for, somebody in an office. And so we do try to track by what their job is, and then what we're seeing when we try to recruit, or if we're losing a lot of employees to the thing. Like I said, last summer was rough with that private sector. It took a lot of
Yeah, for
employees.
sure.
We can get you the
Let me-
analysis,
okay,
Travis
sorry.
did. Oh, you're good. So, delving into the general fund, which is going to be a lot of this discussion today. So some of the key trends with the general fund is, one thing we're doing is we're moving any development-related revenue and any development-related expenditure to its own fund. So it won't be housed in the general fund anymore. And we'll get to this a little bit later, but in essence, we're moving about 3.7 million of revenue and 3.6 million of expenditures. I did want to point out what we had budgeted for revenue on these different items was 6.6 million. A lot of the difference between that 3.7 and that 6.6 is there has been a slowdown in the housing market. But as you can see, we're still having revenue to cover our expenses there that we'll talk about a little bit more later. We'll get to it in the next slide, but I am right now projecting, it says 1.7 million on here, but with these insurance changes, it's down to 1.6 million. So it's heading in the right direction. And one thing we'll need to do as part of evaluating the budget and how do we move forward is looking at our capital improvement plan and what we have funded in that for next year. Once again, one of the few tables I put in, so this is a high-level summary of the general fund by category. So it's showing the original budget, which is that third column over, and then the fifth column is the proposed budget, and any differences. Revenues like taxes, you'll notice I've got a projection of going up 2%. We'll delve into that a little bit more. Charges for services is falling mainly due to some of that development related revenue, and as you can see, the big one is licenses and permits, the development related. The only thing that's really left in that category, that 45,000, is business licensing. The rest is going to that new fund. There are also on the expense side corresponding reductions. The one thing I do wanna point out is part of the evaluation of what expenses constitute something that's development related. I went through and evaluated basically every position in the city and had them fill out a survey saying, what do you do relative to development? And we'll go through how much we were able to allocate through that, but even development's getting charged a portion of the debt service on this building for the space they use, facilities, fleet, so it really does touch a lot of part, even communications, since they cover meetings, and that type of thing. So overall at the bottom, it's 7% of the budget, we're in deficit right now. I threw the number at the bottom, cause a lot of times the first answer whenever you hear there's a deficit is, oh, we need to raise property taxes. Not that I'm proposing this, but the number would be 173% if it was completely funded with the property tax increase, so.
So is it not
Yes,
a viable
but
option?
I threw it up there just so you would know.
That puts it in perspective.
And that's just the general portion of property tax, it doesn't include the safety districts. So moving to revenue, we've got a chart, so the majority of our growth really has been in sales tax, so over the past 5 years, it's increased 20%, an average of 20% per year. That's due to a number of factors, mainly our population's increased, and then with inflation, everything costs more, so more sales tax is being collected. And a big one that came a few years ago is
I can ask questions.
internet transactions.
Of that increase in sales tax, how much of it is from the local percent versus population?
So I'll skip ahead.
In every chart,
We have it right there.
okay, then, you can keep going if
Well,
if it's.
We can go here. So
We
this,
always tout like the increase in sales tax, but it's proportionate with the population growth, not our businesses.
right, so this chart
It's not.
shows, so the green portion is how much our point of sale has increased. The tan color is the statewide pool, so as you can see, the growth has really come from the pool.
Which
His other is
sucks
just
more
kind of steady.
services.
Well, this is a steady, at least it's not flat, it is growing as we add businesses, but this is definitely your primary driver behind.
Right.
sales tax.
Is that about $500,000 from 22 to 23? Or what are you thinking?
Uh,
I guess you're
roughly,
almost three, so almost $1 million, roughly.
That's the trend, right? So very steady in the green and
Yeah.
steep.
For population.
To break it down by percentage, that's pretty stark.
So this is just a chart showing our different categories of revenue. Last year, so 23 what we're budgeted and the 24 what we have budgeted, so the blue is the current year fiscal year 23, the green is 24, so as you can see, I am currently budgeting an increase in sales tax. However, I probably will need to revisit that before the final budget's adopted, just because we're seeing some reports coming out that they're expecting flat sales tax. We've even seen on our end, our growth has started to slow down, however, I really ratcheted back the increase I was expecting, so we're fine if it still continues to grow, but it is just kind of stop in its tracks and we might have to revisit. As you can see, licenses and permits is essentially, was a big portion of our revenue is now dropping down to almost zero, except for business licensing.
Cause that's one of those assumptions we had, right?
Well, I think the auditor alert, to be honest with you, it had come out when the budget was approved. I don't know what Alan's philosophy of how he was going to approach that was. So it was known, but he didn't factor that into the budget.
Hey, Kyle, what falls into that other tax column?
So we're gonna get to that. So it is phone tax, transient room, and cable TV. So what this chart shows is of our different tax revenues, which ones are increasing at what rates. As you can see, sales tax is what's driving the increase. Energy is that almost yellow tan line. It was fairly flat for a while, however, Dominion Energy and Rocky Mountain just passed rate increases. So that's starting to tick up. Telephone tax is going down because more people are ditching their landlines and going for lower cost services. Cable TV's also, it shows flat on this line, but it really is also falling.
These little ticks here in the property tax, that's that HCFSA, the fire safety area, that's us bringing it in and then taking it out. So property tax really hasn't, it's pretty much flat. You haven't changed anything. So there's some slight growth for the growth that's occurred, but those increases there have to do with those transfers.
And this chart, once again, just shows in a pie chart form where our revenues are coming from. So you can see 80% are from taxes, 7% is charges for services. So a lot of that is that Parks and Rec special district fee, which is about $1 million. That's in charges for services. Intergovernmentals, your Class B and C road funds, couple small grants, and then miscellaneous and fines and forfeitures are a small part. Just to delve a little bit more into sales tax, I'm sure you understand how it works, but sometimes it's just good to go over the basics on how it's calculated. So, as many as you know, when point of sale is received, 50% is automatically given to us at Harriman. The other 50% goes into a statewide pool, which is then split out based off of population. In addition, and we do account for it separately, is there's what's called the fourth quarter, that is just for transportation. And I do have the split out there, so 20% goes to the county, 40% comes to UTA, and then 40% to us. The interesting thing, and this is a misconception, is the internet transactions. So Amazon purchases, a lot of people think we get the 100% of that. It still goes through that 50-50 formula, even though it's sourced to Harriman, so.
The population base, is that off the census or is that off our updated numbers or how's it work?
It's census, and I'm not sure how they,
Factor.
I believe they're still using census data for the estimates between censuses.
That's why you push so hard for people to fill out their census.
Well, and we've discussed this, the numbers are low. I mean, they don't accurately reflect the population. Like, I think they've got us at 58,000 right now.
It's been normal for these.
Yeah.
They,
7 to 10,000 behind.
You almost always lag, right? Because the number we're using right now was July 1, 2022. We'll get this, or no, it's actually 2021. They'll switch us this year and it'll be based on like 2022.
they usually will update it in June.
And it's for the July previous.
Yeah.
Next, I do wanna talk about property tax a little bit, since that's a discussion that comes up quite a bit. This chart shows based off of the average, home value, which is around, it's a little under 600,000 is for us, where the money's actually going. So as you can see, about half goes to the school district. It's that hot pink, which I had to pick to differentiate the colors out. So you can see it, library's 150, county 630. The green is Harriman, and that includes the general and then the 2 safety districts. So it does include both on that. This next chart shows our tax rate and our average tax amount versus other cities in Salt Lake County, with the exception I pulled out Brighton and Alta because of their size. And as you can see, unincorporated county's the highest, Draper's the lowest, and a lot of times these cities on the lower end have very large sales tax bases, so that's being used to subsidize it.
This is including their extension, most of them
Right.
would just do it through their
They just,
normal tax rate.
Right.
correct, so this is fire, this tannish
Yeah,
color.
tannish color.
Green is police and then blue is general fund,
So
just
like
general.
Riverton has no general property tax.
Correct, they don't have a general.
Does it have massive sales tax?
It's another reason I keep saying, when you talk about commercial, there's a broader definition than just retail. Many other things, balanced land use that pays to these things that doesn't use the services.
Hospitality and auto sales.
And
Every freaking residential unit costs money to service.
And I think Draper probably per capita has a much higher property value because of the commercial that's paying in there, so this can also be lower.
Right,
because you have a
they
bigger
also, I don't know how much it brings them, but they also charge a franchise fee. So on their water bill, they actually charge a franchise fee that actually goes to the general fund.
base. So they're charging their own utilities.
Yeah.
That franchise fee.
Sandy used to do that, but the state auditor came in and said you can't do it the way they were doing it, and they elected to not, reinstitute it. And then some of these cities, Bluffdale is a very low service city. Holiday has very high property values. I mean, I could go through the whole list, but there's. This next chart shows where exactly our money's budgeted or where our money's being spent. So you see 38% of, and this is general fund only. 38% is personnel, 26% operating, 9% is debt service. So this includes our sales tax bonds plus the payment we have for the public works land. Capital outlay, so this is also what we're spending in the general fund and then also what we're transferring out to the capital projects fund. 4.2, the public safety others, so that's everything but police, so that's animal services, emergency, and community services. And then the admin fee offset, so this is what we're charging other departments for services the general fund employees and operations provide, so. And this chart, I thought it might be useful to see from a department level where the money's going. So as you can see, Parks and Streets, some of our core services use a lot of our resources. I do like to say on streets that a lot of what is funding streets is Class C road funds and then that fourth quarter sales tax. And that streets number does include our normal pavement restoration that we're spending over $1 million a year on, so that strictly isn't just the streets employees and their operating expenses, it does include that pavement management program.
So kind of where does this take us? You can go to the next thing. So if we plug these in. So Alan helped do a forecast for me last year, but there were some definite issues with the assumptions and how things were growing, so he had a flat growth across for revenue, a flat percentage for a certain time, but if you think about your sales tax, if you have 10 million in sales tax, you grow by 7%, that's 700,000. But as that base grows, it's not likely that you're going to continue to grow at that rate. So those rates start to come down. So we've made some adjustments. As it's currently set up, this is what would happen in our general fund. So if you go to the next screen, so looking at that, I say, okay, what is this structurally? If I remove all the capital, but leave in the animal shelter that we have to do, the animal services remodel we talked about, and those reimbursement agreements we've already agreed to, this is what the general fund balance starts to look at. So what that tells me is we were overly aggressive on what we could put towards capital. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get towards the end. So this is not what I would traditionally call a true structural imbalance. It's an imbalance in that we've never really had a capital plan before. When we started to do it, we maybe made too big a jump. we have to come back. We use those based on the numbers that came out of that plan. So we'll talk about what that might mean and how we address it as we go through. But again, we're just giving you some information now, and we'll try and wrap it up, give you some suggestions that you can think about, and then come back to us as you have, next week. Once you've had a chance to kind of digest all of this.
So next, we've gone through the general fund. The police department is part of the general fund, but I do separate that out since they have their own dedicated funding source. So first, I like to go with the how did we get here, because I know what I'm telling you today is different than what you've heard in the past, and you've been told that the police was sufficiently funded and they would be fine for a number of years. And so this is this is a different narrative than you've heard in the past. So one of the major things as part of the budget was the impact fee revenue was budgeted as part of operating revenues. So when they were taking revenues and operating expenses, they were including that impact fees as revenue to make things balance. I will be very clear, at the end of the year, accounting was splitting those out, making sure they were getting restricted and being tracked. But what that did is the general fund ended up having to cover that deficit at the end of the year when we were doing our year-end entries.
And I'm gonna apologize, I didn't
How did
realize
our
that was
auditor
happening until
not?
last year.
Well,
They
that
don't-
is
they don't audit
perfectly,
they don't audit
and
those
because we
numbers.
were restricting the revenues, they were being accounted for correctly according to the impact fee law. And the accounting, they don't audit our budget practices, they're not saying, oh, you've got an A+ on your budget. They really are only making sure that the expenses being recorded and the revenues are accurate. But they don't audit your budget and say, no, you shouldn't be budgeting things a certain way, if that
So-
makes
It's the
sense.
same, we get awards for these budgets, but I had conversations lots of times before saying, shouldn't we be doing an internal audit to see, are we doing best practices? Is that really the way that those should be going? And this is basically what's happening is an internal audit, saying, no, that's not the way that practice should be going.
Yeah, it's
Well, walk me through mechanically
Sure.
what's happening with those again.
Sure. So, in the budget, Fund
Actually-
15, or
I think if you flip to the next slide, it might,
'Cause this one
you might
is
be
a
able to
new
walk through what happens at the end here. And maybe not.
well, yeah, I don't know if this helps. So what happened was the budget was approved, it had impact fees as a revenue, so maybe it was like, I'm just gonna throw out numbers. Overall revenue was 10 million, a million of that was impact fees, expenses were 10 million. So overall the budget balanced. So we'd be, we were recording revenue during the year, recording expense during the year. At the end of the year, when we calculate fund balance, we have to restrict the impact fees. So Alan or myself, last year it was myself, we got 800,000, I would take that, put it in restricted, the remainder would be unrestricted.
So so what happens in that is that
So
it's
is
an
that money,
unintended.
so is that money still being set aside
Yes.
to,
Correct.
It's sitting in restricted fund
so
balance.
there
in
is
general
money
fund.
there?
Yes.
Okay.
So what's really happening is
But
without
that's
your.
what's being transferred from the general fund to make up for it?
Correct, so
Right.
it's a general fund subsidy without council knowing about it, it's kind of an autopilot, because this is a general governmental fund.
So this is the
This
part
gets all
Alan
pushed
flat
together.
out lied to us in the general meeting when I asked if the general fund was subsidizing the police department anyway, and he said, no, not in any way, shape or form.
Not until the end of the year, till he balances the books.
And another important thing is we combine the police, animal services, all of that gets lumped to, that all gets rolled into the general fund when we issue the financial statements.
Cause it's a general governmental fund, they don't,
Oh, I
we keep it separate,
I
but,
understand the accounting,
Yeah.
but there's,
well, this is the number that, as Kyle brought this to me, we all sat in here and thought, you got about $360,000. I don't understand that, because this is from 2020, this was a shortfall, this was a shortfall. One of the biggest challenges they had in there, some of it's related to our software that we use. And it's the same thing for water. Kyle said, I went through all these spreadsheets to figure out how did we miss these employees, starting as far back as 2019. They would get a printout from payroll, stick it in there, and then they would add new employees. There was never a moment, it doesn't appear, they went through and said, was any position vacant on that day? Because it's not an HR system, it's a payroll. It would only kick out who was here. So if somebody had left and we were recruiting, it doesn't show up on that list. So you put that in, well, the next year, if you grab that spreadsheet and bring it forward and you just have 3 you don't go through, I could look at it and say, oh, we're adding 3 new ones, but if I count the names, I'm starting to lose employees, specifically in water. We were losing employees, even though we were saying we were adding, we were not accounting for the positions we had. In PD, this was one of my first things, and I look at Cody and Chief, because they called me down and said, we're concerned. So I went and begged, borrowed, and demanded a spreadsheet, finally got it and sent it down because I didn't know everybody's names. And so tell me who's on this list, who's here or not here. And it was, officers who hadn't been here for years.
5, 6 officers.
Yeah.
And we knew, there's a lot of we's and they's being here, but we never got to see that. Personnel every year, so we
So we're
just got the same
switching,
information you got, which
Yeah,
was,
so
there's
it's really
360.
difficult.
we are
to find out.
switching how we do that, but that's this under budgeting personnel. And again, sometimes you look through and realize they've added people, but they didn't account for any benefits. Depending on the position, and if that starts to snowball through the years, again, water was the one that I spent most of the time on this year, so when Kyle brought it to me, I'm like, how do we, and so I've been through all these spreadsheets, there are no notes, you're just looking at numbers, I guess it would be forensic forecasting, not accounting. I'm looking through and saying, how did they get to where they were going? And then I just started counting names and realizing we're dropping people. Not maliciously, but just because the way we were doing it, we weren't tracking by allocation, we were tracking by name. You can do as long as you keep vacant. If somebody leaves, you put vacant in, and they weren't. And so it's just one of these things. And then I could see one year where we didn't add any burden. The next year we added more people and added burden, but we lost a couple names, so we were now short people. So it's just, it all starts to add up. This year, as we rebuilt this, we did it differently. We actually are doing it by the allocation to make sure we have all the positions, whether they're vacant or filled, so we don't have that.
So I had the same conversation in a different board the other day, and somebody from another city said that they do it at 98%. They look at what their vacancy rate is over time, and then when they budget, they only do it at a certain percent of that. And then some people were like, no, we don't like doing it that way. We want to do it at 100%, and then we take whatever the underspend, and we roll it in the water district into a different account. So it's tracked that way.
Couple budgeting philosophy approaches.
So
We
you haven't
do-
had a policy apparently, but is
Yeah.
your policy going to be doing it at 100%?
Yes, so the main reason for that, cause I went through this with UPD and you probably have been through this too. That assumes you're gonna have a certain percentage of your employees leave, which I never hate to play that roulette game, because you might have, especially in small departments, you might have employees stay the entire time. UPD, the last years, I was over it, started running into that issue. They budgeted us at 97%, but we didn't lose anybody. So then they're coming back and saying, oh, you need to pay more because you're short, so.
Yeah, I much prefer doing it
Yeah.
at the 100%, and then if there's left, if there's a money not spent, we can figure out that. It's a lot easier than trying to come back and go, well, we assumed it would be this and it wasn't, so,
Yeah, we budgeted at 100%.
Okay.
Is there, I had this question come up the other day when I was looking through this, is there anything criminal that's happened in the past or
I like to call it just sloppy.
sloppy oversight? Yeah.
Certainly the personnel projections were just sloppy, lazy. It is hard when you don't have a true HR system where you can say, because in an HR system, when you back somebody out, it'll just go, you
Yeah.
say, is the position eliminated or vacant? So when you pull it, it'll still show. In this, because they were just going to the payroll system and say, download payroll. Then they would put it in. Sometimes it appeared they were doing that like every other year, for police, like every third year, they drew a payroll number and just kept it. But they never went back through to see, well, who's here And is that base rate that I'm now growing this on, is that still the same rate? And if it's 3 years and you're using a spreadsheet and you haven't moved it up, it's wrong. You're starting with the wrong salary on some of those. So there were, as I've looked through some of that, I would just say it was too much on one person. Right, you're
For
trying
sure.
to do too much, and it's easy when you get that way to just
Fix it at the end.
try to, yeah. This next one right here is a big one, and that is valley-wide. The Utah County city managers, hurl curses and invectives at us when we're at meetings, cause they're seeing huge strains in their public safety now, as Salt Lake County is, there's a fight for officers.
Yeah.
So we're seeing this one, you have a percentage on one of these here.
Right, so
I don't wanna say-
also kind of the last thing before we move on, because during the pandemic, we weren't purchasing vehicles, we had more funds available to cover these increased costs. And so as this year, when we were actually able to buy vehicles, as you saw when I came to you with that enormous budget amendment, asking for money from the safety area to cover that.
So that was probably also masking a little bit of what was going
Yeah,
on.
for sure.
So.
And again, it should have been really easy to see, and should have been this numbers floating out there.
Yeah.
Growing.
Yeah, you should,
So what this chart shows, what I attempted to do is show how much revenue is being lost due to inflation. As you know, with the way the property tax works in Utah, is we receive our base amount plus any new growth, and then next year that new growth becomes part of the base. But there's never any inflation built in to the calculation. So this green portion is the base, so that's the amount we receive every year. That tan portion is the new growth that occurs, and you're seeing the base go up because the next year that new growth is falling into the base. The blue part at the top is if I was to factor in just an inflationary increase, and I just based it off of CPI, how much revenue is actually lost. So like if we had gone and done truth and taxation every year for the amount of inflation, how much extra revenue would we have? And so since the inception of the safety area, it's about 1.6 million. The key factor, I also was curious, how much new growth are we getting? Cause really that's the new money the police department has to increase their budget, and that's about $550 a year. Whereas our personnel increases have been outpacing that $550.
Could you add that to our legislative questions with our legislators, cause that's been talked about a lot of times about rather than cities and towns having to do truth and taxation hearings every year just to keep up with inflation. They've definitely have batted that around a little bit just to build in some sort of an inflationary measure into property tax. Let's see what the temperature is at the legislature to do that, especially in these kind of inflation years and stuff. Cause that would be much easier than just constantly having to have a new truth and taxation here and here goes.
I think West Valley has done one every year simply because
Yeah.
to deal with the inflation. They're not a rapidly growing city, so that's whatever they have is what they have.
And so we have it, but I know it's been talked about, so let's talk to them about that.
This next chart, and you'll see this format of chart a lot, I seem to like it a lot. So this shows the bar graphs are the expenses for the department by type. So as you can see, the blue is personnel, which is approximately 80% of the police department's budget. The blue line is their revenue, so this includes not only property tax, but they do have, SROs and grants and other things that come in. So this shows, as you can see, due to that subsidy from the general fund, for a number of years, their revenue has been less than their expenses, as you can see over time.
And this is, we didn't buy cars, and so that makes it, and then as you start to buy vehicles again, you see that push, and this one's low because we bought them all right there.
So 2020 and 2021 would have looked substantially worse.
They would have been probably a little, this would be thicker, right, because you would be buying vehicles. 2020, we'd only been operating
Yeah.
for 2 years, 2.5 years, so we probably weren't quite ready to start buying a lot of vehicles. we're getting into a more normal rotation of the, well, aside from COVID, we would be into a more normal rotation for vehicles.
So next is, as Nathan did for the general fund, I did for the police department, so I did a 10-year forecast, for the police department. I reached out to the chief and deputy chief and got what their requested staffing plan was, and also their planned vehicle replacement, and that's at the tab 5 in your sheet if you want more detail on how many positions they were planning each year and which vehicles they were planning on replacing. And I do have a chart for this, but as you can see, with their staffing plan and their vehicle replacement plan, it does show it by 2033, it's almost a $12 million deficit between their revenues and their expenses.
This average property tax increase, is that annual average?
Right.
You would need that
So,
over 10 years.
If we were to adopt,
Over 10 years or 10-year, 10%?
A year,
Each.
right?
That's
Two
what
and a half
we're-
percent a year for 10 years. Well, actually, you have to front load it.
Right.
So, but that's the
That's what I read
average.
yeah, I just basically took 24.
That's not gonna happen, guys.
Again, we're showing these sometimes
Yeah.
just because we want you to understand the realities when somebody's, well, we can,
What is that on an average home in our community?
I'd have to,
What's the 170, if you did the 174%, this is the police though, so.
Yeah, that's, yeah, cause on the city it would probably be, $20. No, just kidding, but, it'd be much
it's,
more.
and we can do
Yeah,
that for next time, for next Wednesday, we
Sorry,
can
I'm
show it
just
to you.
curious to know.
No, it's a good
To know
question.
and I knew it about a week ago.
Is this just our tax increase, cause that was on the other side, right, for the police, or?
This is
So-
strictly
For the
just.
police.
So this would be HCC.
Okay.
So
Right.
the
Back of my
HCC.
head,
Not the
compounding
fire,
math,
not the
that's
city,
double the
just the
rate in
HCC.
7.5 years.
Yeah, we looked at it, it was like
It was like
136% over the 10
Yeah.
years
So
or
you'll,
something like that.
so whatever you're paying right now, if you did this, you'd be paying double that in 7 years.
Yes. So if you, is it
Do you want me to go back?
no, I think you can go forward,
Okay,
just to see, this next one shows a cumulative, what it does to their fund balance. It's not
Those
not
things
meant
are
to
going
pile
the wrong
on.
direction.
there's-
It's not necessarily meant to pile on, but, it's probably about a $60 million hole.
Did you
right now.
accidentally put this upside down?
I can't take credit for this chart.
I put that, and I was like,
This is Nathan's chart.
again, these are cumulative balances, so you start to come down,
Not looking good.
So the growth model that was put together years ago, again, was based on, well, it's covering it. So it's probably aggressive, right? We're gonna have to take a step back from that. Law enforcement is and Chief's very good at using statistics, it's really driven by what's happening, right? And so when you have a lot of crime, you're gonna need more officers. Types of crime, there is not a crime prevention program that officers are ever gonna do that are going to reduce domestic violence. Right, it's a wrong kind of,
What I said.
but that's a lot of our big calls. So as we look at this, we're likely, there'll be a couple things, moving some of that growth out, we may have to look at our fleet rotation and push those cars a little bit longer. Especially as we're seeing just, I think that cars went up in the last 2 years like 40%, what we've been paying, I mean, almost 50% more than what we used to pay. And if you're trying to rotate and add officers, it's a very difficult nut to crack. Now that what's been happening with the general fund covering it, that is not wrong, it's not illegal, but it should be a decision you consciously make as a council and not one that gets all rolled up at the end, because then you can decide, you have to weigh your priorities.
So it's not sustainable.
Well, not when you saw the general fund budget doing its own thing.
And I will just say one last thing. This really was me taking numbers from police and dumping it in models, so we didn't go back and massage the numbers at all. It really was just a dump and.
And they can speak, but I think they built their models based on information they had from previous things and
Right.
and we do have to step back and say,
What's our actuals?
realistically, we think, okay, we're gonna add officers this year, but our statistics show we don't, so we just slide them. So some of it may slide, but when you're a town of 120,000 people, you will likely have a department as big as they're projecting, right? You're going to have 70, 80
It's
officers.
just how do you get there? How do you pay for it along the way?
Well, it's-
Quick,
yeah.
quick question on the, going back to the impact fees, what's that number been the last couple of years?
The amount we've received every year, the
The
balance,
amount that's being fudged at the end?
it's around 800,000.
It was that chart,
Roughly, there's,
right? No, the one
back,
back, this
There
one,
you go.
it's this number right here.
some of that also, so there were some budgeted revenue in there that was never going to come in. They had, and not these weren't police department recommendations, this was done by finance.
Right.
It's just the,
There were SROs in there that we don't have SROs for. There were some grants that were a little aggressively funded. It's like the whole amount isn't impact, but it's around 800.
That's a good point, while we're not looking at this as the police department's fault, I'm looking at this as our prior
Right.
administration, finance, people's fault.
Well, and trying to, again, work
so quick.
Water's up.
But I know not looking for answers, but when we look at these numbers, you're looking at those tax increases, the 1.6, there's 800 right there that we weren't doing it right. So that's gonna be my first question when we get there, is how do you right size for that 800 you've been using that wasn't really there?
I think that's your first thing and we'll, as we talk about it, okay, you've got to get
We gotta get back down to where we should.
to your base and then
Then
you
we
can
can
decide.
Then we can talk about
Yeah.
inflationary increases.
Yeah, for sure.
So real briefly, I touched that we're creating a new fund for the development services, development fees. So as I had mentioned previously, this will capture the revenue, like building permits, planning fees, that type of thing that had been coming in. Any direct, expenses, and then also, as I mentioned, we're allocating, some expenses. One proposal I will be bringing forward when we talk about the fee schedules, I would like to eliminate the credit card fees that we're charging, cause that's really just affecting those building permit fees. And, number two, as you'll see when we get to the next slide, they do have the funds with the current fees to cover it. The last point is we're doing a fee study, it actually kicks off in a couple weeks. We can actually build those fees into the study, so we can continue it, it won't be an issue where I say, let's eliminate this now, and then a year and a half or 2 years, I'm coming back saying, no, we need to put the surcharge back into place.
Okay.
I'm still waiting for numbers, but I'm actually gonna save us quite a bit on credit card fees, by switching providers, so that will also help with that too. This chart just shows, I went and did an evaluation of revenue based off of current environment. This wasn't so in-depth that I went down to building and looked at all the entitlements and what's on the plate coming up. It's numbers I feel are conservative enough. That'll cover it. The personnel and operating, those are direct fees, so that's mostly the building department, and then we have an engineer that works 100% on development. The admin fee, as I had mentioned, that's where I went out to the departments, determined how much time they were spending on development related items and allocating their costs. In addition, I did such things as facilities, fleet, anyone that touches development services, I allocated part of their time. So with that came to almost $2 million. And then overall, we have about 89,000 left over, based on the budget. And it's good to have a fund balance with this because, as you know, permits can be relatively volatile. We have a lot of fixed costs of the department, so you do want to have some reserves in there, to cover that.
Just one quick comment from my colleagues, this is why I said that what they say, large development coming in, you say there's this much in this sort of revenue, it's not revenue that we get to just go spend.
Right.
There's
Yeah.
direct expenses.
So next, I will, fire safety area, the picture's a little better, so,
Not
There's-
for now.
yeah. But it's better than what I've presented so far. The assessment next year is about 5.3 million. We do have a debt service payment, as you know, about to UFA. I'm gonna start splitting that out in the budget reports instead of just combining it with our contract fee, so you can see that better. Tax revenue estimated 8.4, and then we do receive about 60,000 from UFA as part of the settlement agreement of our portion of the fund balance. I did also calculate, I know there's been some questions on if the service district should be participating in the CRAs, so for Anthem, that would reduce the tax revenue by about 115,000 for next year. And then lifetime would be about 3 million, if the board decided to participate in this CRA.
And that CRA has a max of what, 11.5 million or something like that, that's supposed to be paid out over time.
I'd have to
So
double
we would
check.
have to look and see
Yeah.
what their assessed value is higher than our projections. Right now, they've already met, and that's probably due to some inflation in the market based on what that was done, so. It's actually something we're gonna have to schedule an HCFSA meeting, so you guys can talk about that, but we'll let that.
Anyway, there's an initial number. I also did a 10-year forecast for the fire safety area. And these numbers can change, of course, I just threw these in for the models, so it would be a rebuild in 25, future station in 28, using the impact fee balances we have at the time of construction to help offset the construction costs. Operating increases of 6%, and then the new growth assumption, so that's what I would expect, that's what I put in to model the property tax increases. As the number gets larger and larger, your percentage increases are gonna decrease. It's like when Vineyards had 2,000 residents and they say we went up 150%, but they really only, went up to 5,000 or 6,000, so. So overall, with that, the fire safety area has a positive fund balance for all 10 years, really beginning in 2030 is when the fund balance starts to drop, once those operating costs from that second station start to be factored in. Right now, this also assumes that the stations are cash financed. Of course, there are bonding options. I've already actually talked to Jonathan Ward about some options that wouldn't require us to use sales tax as a pledge. There are some options. We still get as good of a rate as a sales tax bond, so it's financing other cities' use, so it's not like we're going out on some weird market to get these. This is more just in graphical form. Once again, the orange line is the revenue expected. That also includes those transfers in from the impact fees during the years we're building those stations. Operating costs, as you can see, they dramatically increase once that second station is built.
So the station, so 103 goes, this next station at 2028 timeframe is, generally think around the Salt Lake Community College area is where they're projecting we need a station because the way Mountain View works. It's not that far from Station 123, but because the way the growth works, that's, and that's a full intersection of Mountain View, that's the one that seems to make the most sense.
What about all the growth to the west, like with Olympia?
So, probably outside of this plan, but right on the edge of that plan, you probably need another station somewhere that, we met with the fire district, they ran some numbers for us and charts. There are still a few things they have to upgrade because they didn't have some roads connecting like they should. But, there's likely a station on Harriman Main Street, but up by that 7300. We actually own property there already. So that's what we're having them model because we don't have to worry about the Rio Tinto Midas property. That one looks like that cover us.
So 103 will cover it until 2030.
Yeah, depending on growth, and the hard part with those numbers is what they're trying to do is how do you get 17 people out of fire? But 80 to 90% of their calls are medical, and you don't need 17. So it's an interesting number when you're looking at it, so we'll have more conversations.
Fire department would be more aptly named, just the fall department.
So, yeah, emergency medical. So we know right now it,
He's not here.
the RSL, kind of that area, that part of town needs the station first. The projection on to win, the numbers they showed us out through 2050, so by 2050, we need these stations. It's when that next one triggers that it's not 100% clear, but it's further out than, it's probably that 2024, 2025 time.
And interestingly enough, that's where we're gonna start seeing our call volume increases on that side. It's already happening.
Different types of homes and things
Wonder
like
why.
that.
What's that?
Just, yeah, that makes sense.
There's a lot more people there. There is.
Traffic is exceeding even some of the other calls. Domestic violence is one of the high ones, but our traffic problems out there are increasing quickly,
Sure makes sense.
faster than our infrastructure is.
This next chart just shows, the tan line is recommended fund balance, so that's another policy that we'll need to bring to you. This recommended fund balance is based off of GFOA guidelines of 2 months of operating expenses. Of course, the council can set whatever they want. When we have that discussion, we'll go through different options. But as you can see, the green bars are the ending fund balance, so there still is sufficient fund balance during the 10 years. You will notice starting in 2031, the fund balance starts decreasing because the operating costs have increased with that new station, so.
We should have probably done fire last because it was more happy.
Says everybody.
Remember that. I know.
Everybody likes that.
Yeah, I really should have done it last. The next one. So as I had mentioned previously, we are right in the middle of a water rate study, so that hasn't been fully completed yet. They're still working on the master plan and timing of those projects and other assumptions, and Justin and I have had multiple meetings with the consultant. The next thing we'll actually bring to you in June is some different rate structure options. We asked them to look at possibly consolidating the rate structure so there weren't as many rates. A lot of it is also the administrative side, because when you have to set up an account, you have pages and pages of rate structures to go through. Making sure everything's set up correctly is a challenge. So these charts were provided by the consultant based off their initial findings. I haven't looked at the data, approved it yet, but we wanted to at least apprise you of what they are initially finding. So this first chart has a lot on it, but basically it shows what happens to fund balance depending on different scenarios. So you'll notice there's a green band that runs through the middle of it. That is what they're recommending for the target reserve, which is 180 days of operating expenses on the low end, 360 on the high end. The black line is if we do nothing, we don't do anything with rates, we would expend all of our fund balance in 2024. There's different rate options that we're gonna go through. They initially just looked at 3 rates that they see most cities go with. Once again, we would need to come to you as a body and discuss what the options are and get some feedback on what route you wanna go. 2 of them are doing rate increases but not bonding to cover the projects, and then the third one is bonding. I think the third one's probably going to be in some form the one that you'll want to go for.
Probably what staff will recommend.
Yeah, staff will recommend that.
Which one? Option 3.
It'll be that
Yeah.
yellow line, but we'll
We're
show
gonna
you
go
that
through a couple
these
more
are
charts.
some options.
But as you can see, we have a number of years, depending on which model is chosen, to get that operating balance to where it should be.
So, one of the challenges with this chart is it's just showing that CPI growth in the rates, but I don't believe all the projects are in there that are going, the capital projects that are gonna be demanded of the water system. It's been a fairly young system, so you've been the city of Harriman has been borrowing against it, let's just say that, and taking.
Yep.
So now as we start to need to invest back in it as certain parts are aging and, we did get a grant for the Harriman, Old Town Harriman, which is really gonna be helpful. That's where those rates, and I don't know how the last rate structure was, 2019? So inflation has gone up. I imagine laying a mile of pipe in 2019 was a completely different kind of cost than what we're seeing today. So that's one of the needs, and you're supposed to do these, every 3 years? About
3 to
that?
5. Really every year, whether you have the consultant or you do it in-house, you really need to be evaluating to make sure you're hitting the targets in the rate study. Which I will say, nobody does, but you're supposed to. Yeah, it is. Once again, these are charts provided by the consultants, so they provided 3 options I had mentioned. This first one is if the council decides we'll do one large rate increase to start, to kind of kickstart the cash flow in the fund, and then do small rate increases. So what that would equate to, it's that purple, actually that purple is the graph, but in that purple, it's hard to read, it's a 37.5% rate increase the first year, and then 3% rate increases after that until 2029.
Will you give me a number on that? What does that mean to the average citizen? How much would that 37% hit them? Like for an annual, because obviously you have summer and,
Right.
off-season.
That's a pretty significant.
Yeah.
So, I'll just quick math off the top of my head, my water bill's about $100 a month, just like through the winter for 50 culinary and 50 for the secondary that I don't use. So 37 rounded to 40%, it goes from $100 to $140.
But what about in the summer? That's when.
Well, it's the same difference,
You're
right?
just, I just wonder though, like,
So 40% increase, that's a lot.
So, as we said,
Yeah,
we're
staff's
not
not
sure you're gonna,
recommending this.
we're just showing it to you because it is an option.
This next one, once again, is cash funding the projects, but trying to break the increases out so you're not just hit with one large increase and then smaller ones. So this one would have 15% increases for first couple of years, then a 10%, then it goes back to 3. And then the final one, which I think as staff we feel is more reasonable, is looking at issuing 2 bonds. So it would be an initial 10% increase next year. And Sherry, we can get you numbers too.
well, still, I mean, it's just a little bit easier versus 15, 15,
Yeah,
10,
yeah.
so this is still 10, 10, 10, 10.
Yeah.
So every year you get hit.
If you look here at the top, this is a 64, it's 65, they're about the same. It's just how fast.
How you wanna spread that out.
Sometimes it's easier to just get yelled at one time versus 4 or 5 or 6 years in a row. I'm just saying.
There is some truth to that.
As I said, this is really just an initial, just to give you an idea of what we're seeing. We don't have the detail back yet. We're not ready to come present.
But kind of the same question, at least for me. How did we get here? Like, cause for the entire time I've been here, it's been water has its own thing, never have to worry about it.
This is my.
Where have we,
this
and
is
I'll
my-
say me, where have we made mistakes?
This is my perspective, and I think Justin also, if you could chime in, cause you've got a lot more experience. One thing I noticed when I went through the rate studies, they didn't have a lot of capital projects in there, and I don't know if I couldn't tell from the study if they were assuming that Impact Fee was gonna be paying for all of those projects or what the issue was. The inflation percentage was also much lower that they assumed in the rate study versus actual. And then those are the main things I've noticed.
Missing employees in the mall.
And
I don't know
I
if
couldn't
those
tell,
costs got.
and I couldn't tell in the rate study if they had captured all the personnel costs or not.
From
At
a
the time, I
budget,
think
that's
they
what you're saying.
did, at the time, I think they did, but like Nathan was saying, that the budgeting for those was never covered. The departments never were able to see the employee structure as far as the, planning for the long-term employees and budgeting. But going back, another part of, to what Kyle said is, Nathan mentioned it either, on the general fund, the capital projects, long-term, these include those capital projects, like Kyle was saying, there weren't as many back when we did the rate study in 2019, and now we're developing that, and so this includes all of those capital improvements.
So kind of what a few of us have been saying for several years of stop looking at the new fun stuff and eventually we're gonna have to replace the old stuff.
Well, this is partly our portion of capital projects to keep up with growth as well. Because a lot of the large capital, only a portion of it is impact be eligible, and this is accounting for those non-impact be eligible portions of those capital projects.
And you will see, your point, you will see more and more of those larger repairs. Again, we're lucky we're getting a grant to cover one of the big ones, but, it's like
So we
your
just never
roads,
properly
everything.
planned.
Well, and I will
There
say
wasn't a lot,
on,
maybe a long range.
on the water portion, water purchases, the study was only expecting 2 to 3% increases a year, which I don't think was feasible. And maybe at the time it was,
First 10 years probably. Last 15, 20 years.
Yeah, we had incremental increases of 2% every year
Yeah.
since 2019.
I think as that inflation, especially your capital inflation, is just making it, it's not possible to do.
and I will say, our-
Inflation's not to blame for all of this. No.
No,
I will also say, our consultant did say most water agencies are experiencing these types of increases, so we aren't alone. The biggest downfall, in my perspective, is not evaluating the study every year, like evaluating your actuals against the study to make sure that the assumptions of the study are still accurate.
so that is one of
That's
the,
a policy choice, and then we need to start doing that.
It's- it was probably a staffing reality, we just didn't have somebody to look at it, so we are trying to rectify that to at least go back and make sure when you pay for this study and says this is what's gonna happen, you can start to chew it up and say, yes, this model's working, no, it's not, we need to step back.
I mean, one of the things I'll recommend, if for some reason we don't have staff time to do it, is we can have our consultant do they call it like a touch-up study, and it's not like a full-blown study, but they can go and update the numbers if it's a personnel issue, so.
It just hasn't.
It's cheaper to do it in-house, but it is possible, and the cost isn't too outrageous.
So as we said, we're in the middle of having them redo it so that we have a good baseline to start from, because we're 4 years into this. So the study was likely done in 18 or 19.
And we'll be coming back in June to start those discussions. So next, is stormwater. So last rate study was also in 2019. The revenue's actually been meeting targets. Luckily, that study I was able to follow a little bit more, I think just because it's not as complex of a fund as the water fund. The capital expenditures were really underestimated in that fund, or in that study. And then O&M expenditures have gone up more than the study said. I will say 2024 is when the study said you should go and do another study for that. And this is a study I went and did in-house. I'm assuming as long as we're not changing rate structures, it is something finance can handle pretty easily.
So if we talk here in that, but those capital items, this top one here, 1.8 million, the clean water, they're mandated, this is coming down. It became a mandate in 2020. So officially as Harriman, you shall now comply with these of your development.
That's why we started the storm drain impact, the storm drain fee.
Oh, that was prior to that. This is something different that came after.
So this is after this fee, it's now mandated for clean water, some best management practices for how you take care of water. This is coming down from EPA. Now I'll say these mandates have been looming over cities for almost my entire career. So as you start doing, but they kept the regulators and the cities, everybody just kicked the can down the road, we'll deal with it later, you've gotta comply with it, but we'll get to you later. Well, now is later, we're sitting here, they told us, here's what you have to do. So my understanding is any of the new things that developers are putting in, they have to comply with this. We're talking about retrofits on storm drain facilities that were already built and are in use, that are owned by the city of Harriman, that we now have to go back and do some retrofitting to meet this clean water
So what's the
standard.
time frame and what's the penalty?
So they haven't really given a penalty, and there's really no time frame. What we've heard is, as long as you're making progress, you'll be okay. That's what
So we don't have
initially-
to be too stressed about 1.8, cause we could.
It's over years.
It is, and so, and that's one of the things is what do we do this? It's a little bit like the ADA. As long as you have a plan and you're actively making progress.
We have a break on the ladder, or we have something that, we have to go and clean something up, we'll fix it as we go kind of thing.
And we have a plan in place, which has identified the projects and the improvements and some cost estimates, and so we provided some
Nice.
plans towards.
These are things like, anywhere from a filter in a catch basin in like a parking lot to deal with oils, greases, everything that comes off that, to sometimes different landscape swells and things to help clean the water before it goes out. So it's a whole mix of items. It's about 1.8 million in, is that today's dollars or? Last year's
That's
dollars.
projected out, so I made an assumption we would do 2 projects a year. So I projected that out, added an inflationary, so this is with inflation.
Well, it comes from EPA, so I don't think they know another version.
Can we run our budget like they run theirs?
This SCADA projects, I would couch those as operational efficiency type things. They'd be really nice to have. They're not a mandate, but essentially SCADA would allow us to monitor those systems, and as we grow, it becomes harder with staff. We'll have to really look at those and do a deeper dive on the return on investment for how long, from a staffing perspective, what do you say?
And one reason why I put those in, because they are not mandated, but we're still working on the third item, the system deficiency projects, and I wanted to have some sort of capital number in there for modeling purposes, so this isn't saying we have to do those, but it was.
This may become this. These, and Justin, correct me if I'm mistaken, some of these are, we received systems that don't work quite like they were on paper supposed to do, like water doesn't go into them like it's, somebody doesn't run uphill. Others, one that we're talking about, the community college pond, the slick pond is what we call it. There was a portion of the drainage that goes to it was left out of the calculation. There was a lot of back and forth between the city saying, are you sure this, oh yeah, it's in there, it's in there. Or it's not in there, it doesn't go there, it doesn't go there. Bunch of consultants said it doesn't go there. Nature said, you're both wrong. I do go there, so we're having to figure out, that we haven't, I don't believe we've actually reimbursed the developers on that, so there are some opportunities for us to, or we haven't reimbursed them completely, to sit down again and say, you messed up on your numbers. So I think, as Kyle says, there's a lot of capital happening here. Some of it is this unfunded mandate. Don't anticipate that will be the only unfunded mandate you ever get in stormwater. That is the most recent. They've been working on it for 20 years. They've been talking about some other things more recently, that every single outfall has to have its own NPDES permit. If that is true, that is, by the time they get to our city, it will be an absolute nightmare to do. But,
So the 5.6 is stuff that we need to do, but it's not critically urgent to do, kind of things.
it's things you're gonna have to do, and one thing we should say, I don't believe this fund was ever really set up to deal with capital. And Kyle, I think, It was an operational, I think it's operational.
There was a certain percentage that
Well,
was
there
set
was a-
aside to deal with.
To
There
do
was
what we
a,
were supposed to.
well, there was a reserve fund
Reserve
that
fund,
was
yeah.
supposed to be, but it wasn't a capital. It was, let's cover the MS4 requirements and have a reserve fund to operate that. There was never really contemplated, and
No, it's capital.
Kyle mentioned it as well when he reviewed it, there was never really a big component of capital projects. It was more maintenance related projects.
And so this one, we have to figure out how do you cover that? Does that become a general fund over time? Do you fit into this fund? There's a lot to talk about in this fund. And they've requested more so we should understand that every time we add more streets, they get more to deal with in this group that's dealing with it.
Seems logical.
And so it's, from the cameraing the system and cleaning the system, there's just,
We have to stop
Sweeping.
building, is that what you're saying?
I don't know that we're allowed to
Just
do
kidding.
that. But it is a pressure every time, so they've requested, hey, we need some additional people, we probably need, so that's where you see that personnel request there.
So this next chart shows, just using current rates, assuming no increases to rates over 10 years. This does include that 1.8 and the 3.8. There's some discussion on when the projects would be timed or they would be approved. Assuming that is the capital, this shows over time what that would look like. So, for next year, there is actually some good news. So when I went through and redid all of the allocation studies, we had probably been over allocating costs to the stormwater fund. We will also go back and amend fiscal year 23 to look at those new percentages too, so that will probably give some breathing room in 23. But with that, as you can see, the expenses outpace revenue. This also assumes in 25. As you know, storm drain last year had requested personnel that was denied due to the budgetary concerns. This would assume those personnel were added in 25, so that's why there's a bump in 25. But overall, the revenue isn't keeping up with those costs.
And this is a forecast, you have not agreed to
Keep messing up
this.
with the graph, you keep printing these upside down.
Yeah, this one's, I didn't.
Yeah, this one, it's the same assumption, so it's looking at fund balance over time. That blue line is target operating reserve, which I went off of the study, which was 180 days, which is for enterprise funds, it's pretty much a standard minimum recommendation on there. I should have reworded this, these necessarily aren't, this is what I would recommend, although it's not really necessarily a staff recommendation, is that if we were to fund that level of capital projects, we would need 10% rate increases for 4 years and then 3% after. We could also ratchet that down depending on what inflation's doing. As I had mentioned, we're still looking for a list of system deficiencies from engineering, which could change everything and how things are funded. One of the things I would like to look at, because of the financial health of the fund isn't great right now, I don't think we could bond off of stormwater revenues. Once things are a little more secure and stabilized, I would like to look at bonding, and we could possibly do some of these projects with bonding instead of trying to cash finance these. Yeah, and there's just a couple charts, so this shows it with the 10% rate increases, as you can see, revenue outpaces expenses to build up that reserve fund. And then fund balance also looks better. The blue is that target operating reserve.
So maybe, do you wanna, so we wanna be mindful of your time at 5:30, so we'll go through our recommendations to you. We're not asking you to decide yes or no tonight. We want you to think about these, and if you have other ideas, we're certainly open, but we've talked through how to do this, so some of this is policy, not just to one fund, some is more specific to funds. I think it's good practice to, if you have a fund, to have a fund stand on its own, right? Not have to be subsidized. That said, we have to understand what some of these funds are doing. They're just tracking special revenues, and so it may be that the general fund will subsidize them. Law enforcement, I don't know if it was always the intent for the property tax to cover it all, but that's
Yes.
something you'll have to think about. It's a big policy decision, and the other, because we built our capital improvement plan, so prior to my arrival, you did not have a capital plan. You had a spreadsheet that came up periodically. Some of you have said you'd see a list, you'd approve a list, and the next year you'd get a different list, and some of those projects that you saw last year you didn't fund weren't on there, you don't know where they happened. We're trying to get a comprehensive approach. We built that CIP based on a number that was provided, and it was, again, as I went through the model and rebuilt it this year, a lot of the assumptions were very, very aggressive. I would say, again, 15% growth in sales tax for every year. If we could get that, that would be absolutely amazing, and this would be a different conversation. I do not believe that's at all realistic. So we actually have those coming down, because as you grow the base, your growth is going to slow. You can't have the same growth all the time. So we're gonna need to re-examine this. And in all those funds, water, stormwater, general fund, looking at how do we move some of those projects out a little bit, and then really focus on what has to happen right now in the near term, right? That some of those things are gonna have to wait. For this coming budget cycle, our recommendation is, we have some positions, we'll show you in a second, in the general fund, we suggest not hiring those, right? They were approved in the biennial, we'll just say, we're not going to fill those right now. Police, water, the same thing. Let's just hold till we get this, we figure out where we're at. Right? Let's not, when you're in a hole, first rule, quit digging, right? So that's what we're saying. I'm gonna meet with all the managers next week to talk about this. So, there are different philosophies in how you budget. The old style that you'll hear is that it's cost plus. Every year, what I spend last year, I add more to it and I just move forward. It's an easy kind of autopilot. It leads to the mentality, use it or lose it. If I don't spend it this year, I won't get it next year. So I've got to go, I had no knock on the chiefs and police, but a chief once, not this chief, said, it's Christmas in June. So I like to play the Grinch and say Christmas is not happening in June. We don't have to we don't want to budget that way. That's a very archaic budgeting approach. The middle step there would be kind of that zero-based budgeting that was really popular for a while, all the way to a priority-based budget. Priority-based budget, you're not necessarily budgeting by division, you're budgeting by project and services. And so you would make a list of services in parks, they do 6 things, and you say, these top 3 we really want to do, we're gonna move money from these ones up to there, right? It begins to allow council to make decisions based on your priorities. That's a pretty big lift to get there. So I say I got it like 80% after 8 years in my last town. Mostly it was the same, we had to replace some software so we could even do it. I would like to move that direction. It starts to allow you to integrate your strategic planning into your budget more than how much did I spend last year plus inflation, that's where we go. And I will say there are some things with personnel that driver does happen, but it's looking, what do we have those people doing? So we are gonna meet on this, canceling Christmas in June. One of the future things is we really need to understand for our purpose, and we've been working on a fund balance policy for council to adopt. What are you comfortable with? So state law, minimum is 5%. That's an insanely low rate, right, for an operation. I don't even know if that covers you for cash flow sometimes. 35% is the max. There is a point where your citizens say, you were holding too much of my money and not doing anything with it. So GFOA, which
I've
is,
never heard anyone say that.
I have, actually, if you have a fund balance that's too high,
I know that that's what special interest groups do, but most people say, well, why doesn't the city save and then pay for it instead of borrowing off the bank?
well,
I know where you're
usually
going.
what happens when you're trying to do it, you say, okay, here's what we're doing, well, use your money you have. And you're talking about ongoing costs and it doesn't work, so.
To try to speed it up from me derailing it. The issue, at least the conversations I've always been in, is bonding, right? You need to have a certain amount to get a decent rating.
Right,
So
right.
GFOA
So we're gonna look
is-
at you guys and say, what's your recommendation?
So GFOA is 2 months, it's like 18%. So I think your general fund anywhere from 20 to 25 is a reasonable amount. 25% is 3 months of your operational expenditures in Utah. What I've learned is states calculate fund balance, or what you have to have differently, so I have to make sure. It's operational funds here, Oregon it was revenues.
Well, technically, the calculation's based off of revenues, but I would say,
It's your operations that you're worried about. So maybe they all do revenues, it just doesn't make sense to me. It seems like you'd be concerned about, I don't care how much money I get, how much do I have to spend? So this is one that we're gonna need some guidance from you on. Again, you don't have to make that today, we're just telling you, we're gonna bring you something, likely it's gonna be in that.
and that
20 to
policy's
25
fairly close to being done, so that one will come fairly quickly.
And we refer to it in our budget document, we just.
Say
never
to
can
now,
find it.
it's always been 25%, I thought, was our target.
Yeah.
We just
Is it
can't
written
find
down
the actual
It's not
policy,
an
so.
actual
Yeah.
policy.
So we're gonna have you adopt one that gives us some guidance on how to do it as staff. So if I got hit by a bus tomorrow, the next person.
We're actually
Figure
gonna
it out.
document things.
It's so
That's
much
crazy.
simpler. So these are the positions right now, and I know this is tough for some of these departments begin because they're going, but these are the ones that are currently open. Are we approved in there? There is a valid reason for every one of those. And they can make you a valid pitch for why they need those positions. But
My
until
wife
we.
tells me we need a housekeeper every year too, so.
Until we get our budget in order, I think the prudent thing is to just hold off.
How does
Sorry,
this,
it's been a long day.
how does this affect those individual departments? Obviously, we wanted to budget them, we needed them. And for a year,
It's going to be like I said,
So-
every one of them could make a valid argument.
they're gonna put another hat on
So
for
we
another year.
did, in March, Nathan and I and Wendy sat down with all the departments, went through their budgets. One of the questions I asked was, if for some reason you don't get this position,
What's the
are you ready to-
outfall?
Yeah, what's the outfall? Everyone said, we'll make it work. There's things that they will have to delay doing. Streets was really the only one that was adamant, I need these positions. The rest were, we can make it work, we can just keep doing what we're doing.
What about police? There's 3 officers, can you make it work?
How does
Basically-
that,
Let me give you an example in streets that just happened. We had the spring cleanup, right?
Yeah.
And that was that was streets that was running that operation, which left them off of potholes, right? So now they've got it, because they have to have a crew out there to flag and
Yeah.
do all of those things. And so one is neglecting the other, right? And we continue to have people bringing trash to Butterfield Park.
I
They're still
drove by there the other
doing
day, I was like, why is there still so much trash here?
Cause they've
People
decided
just
it's
keep
the
bringing.
tipping station.
now,
So that's an example in streets, right?
how does that turn into like overtime? Like, if you had another body, you'd have less overtime throughout the totality, right? If you're running officers at longer overtime
No,
rates.
not necessarily.
Yeah, I don't
Okay.
see a ton of overtime.
We're not working a ton of overtime.
Okay.
These are, again, as the city grows, you have more lane miles to take care of.
Okay.
Again, every one of these IT, we have a police department, they're all, technology is key to everything that we do now.
I will also say with streets, just before we move on, when we had the meeting, they did have 2 open positions that they were recruiting for, so they were already short-staffed.
And so,
There's still 2 open.
and we haven't said not to fill those, at least right now, we're just saying,
Yeah.
don't do the
Don't
new
add
ones.
So
Additional.
open vacant positions can be filled, we don't have a moratorium on that yet,
Uh,
but new positions.
We talk about it before they come in,
Okay.
we may not fill positions that
All
are
of them,
vacant, but some of those, arborists, we grain street trees every year. Trent does a great job. He is one human being. It's almost, I can't see how he's doing it.
Yeah.
So again, I can make an argument for every one of these. No offense, Blake, staff engineer, it would be a harder argument for me to make, but, sorry.
He's not here.
He's not here, yeah. Pick on him. These are positions that are currently vacant, that have been budgeted in past years. Those are requests in '24, these were funded in '23. The accountant, talked with Kyle a bit. He wasn't here when we discussed this. He's okay leaving this open. We're trying to recruit an analyst to help do some things, but we shouldn't be recruiting an accountant. Right, if we're gonna do this, we need more of a senior accountant because of the types of things
Or
that,
a budget,
Yeah.
budget
really what I
analyst
need
or.
is a budget
I've got a
analyst.
calculator.
But,
I've got one.
but I don't want to, short that department, because I think a huge chunk of why we're in this mess is because we did a one-man show in that department. Whether whoever decided that or not, that's debate for another day.
Well, the one-man show with two different jobs at the point in time, yeah.
So we're hiring an analyst right now, and primarily they're gonna help a lot with the budget and some of the things that aren't, some of the deeper dives that aren't getting done that council's asked for. My hope is that position will free Kyle up to do some training of his existing staff so they can take on some more of that accounting role.
Better using your people that you
Yeah.
have.
And in the future, when we do this, this is not a one, right? We're not looking for an entry level that he then has to go and teach.
And so I was wondering that same thing on these interns and accountant, are we paying these interns, can we just do non-paid internships, or do you not get any applications when you do
You
those?
could.
Because you don't generate as good people, or why are we paying?
Those are reasonable
Most
costs
places,
for-
yeah, you're paying them like $15 an hour. It's not a huge amount. And
But
they're,
good return on your investment.
Yeah,
they
If
do a lot of
If
work.
they come higher
it's
on
minimum
too,
wage for people that want them.
yeah.
Okay,
A
that
new
makes sense.
skill, new task.
So right now, this one, I think, I mean, again, development services, you could probably justify it because they charge a fee and we have to show the state. So the thought right now is we probably hold these open, barring something else. Again, with finances, we've talked, it's not, accountant one is not what, that's what Alan budgeted and put in there. This is the fully loaded with burden and well,
Yeah.
all their overhead, their benefits.
Benefits.
Burden. It is a weird term.
Yeah, this is the first place I heard it. So that's why I think I'm comfortable just saying, let's just hold these for right now. Again, if we run into an issue where hiring a GIS or planning intern would be helpful for a project, we may
Yeah,
do it. But, what's the next slide? I should be
Be in
keeping up.
balance.
So really, what do we have here? In the general fund, it's not structural at this point. It's really, we have to right size how we're doing capital. We'll talk about that in a second. For some of the other funds, it is structural. And so we need to make a decision on how we're going to do these, because in a structural issue, it's going to continue forever until we make a significant change. We change some of that structure. And we didn't talk a whole lot, but changing your service level is always an option for the council, right? How do we do that? That is a painful option, maybe less painful than looking at your revenues, but those are the things.
Well, I wouldn't look at it as cutting services, it would be right sizing services.
That's a great word.
So in this budget philosophy, I think Harriman traditionally has probably spent more time in between these two. You spend it, and if you have any left over, you're putting it towards the capital, right? If we had any left over, some years you didn't have it left over, some years you did. The best practice is you're over here, and Frank, this is probably my fault. I tried to jump us right over to here, where we budget for a CIP. What are we doing? How are we investing? Because if you don't spend your money on your infrastructure, you're borrowing from it, right? It's got a lifespan, and if you're not maintaining it, you're using it like a savings account, and you're pulling out of it. You've got to reinvest at some point. So, I still want to be over here. We may have to bounce between these for a little bit. Just in this short thing, Revenues, expenses, ongoing versus one time. I appreciate how, is this from GFOA or is
No,
this
this
yours?
actually is from Denise Steck at West Jordan.
Okay, this is a classic that where you'll see people will go get grants, go get this, grants are great for one time. If you're using them for operational costs, not to pick, but years ago when Clinton put out the COPS grants, that made people, right, you're gonna get citizens out, you're gonna get more police officers on the street, we're gonna pay for those officers. You're gonna hire them, guarantee them for 4 years, I'm paying you a decreasing amount for the first 3 years, and you gotta keep them for the 4th year, or you have to pay us back. A lot of cities got themselves seriously upside down because nobody sat through and said, can we actually afford them on the 4th year? And I know a lot of cities who got in serious trouble because they got big grants. The cops group said, you asked for 1, why don't we give you 2 or 3? Oh, great, we got 3. The first year was 100%. Second year, wow, that was a little hard. Third year, wow, that was our 4th year. Oh my goodness, we're in trouble. We're gonna get
for 4 years.
slammed. So, and that was because they purposely put people into this danger zone. So you have to just be careful as we look at our revenues. We do have some one-time expenses coming up. Our software, we desperately need to upgrade our finance software. It doesn't even run on a full SQL database. If you're an IT person, you understand, it's crazy.
Hiring freeze, it is
Budget.
freezing in here.
This room has two
Jackie keeps
temperatures,
on
hot
changing
and
it.
cold, and then there's like
And don't,
30,
don't sit directly under that.
there's like a
Sit right
30-second window of comfortable temperature as it swings between the hot and the cold.
Sorry.
I texted Jackie a minute ago to turn off the air because I was dying and so was Chief, and it went off, then it kicked back on.
Yeah, so all of these are different options that we need to look at. Again, we're talking maybe some, again, so when we have our CIP, those numbers and what they built were based on a projection we'd have X number of dollars. We can't push, hey, you've got to spend X. We're trying to come up, what's a realistic number for us to spend and grow that. So I should say, when I reduced all the capital, I did keep your annual asphalt maintenance in there, that about 1.5 was in that number. So that stays, but it's how do we do big projects? There are a lot of projects that have been needed for a long time. You can see it, you see the roads, but you also drive on some of our roads, and I always pick on roads because they're so visible to us. We always forget about the stuff underground, but those roads, 5600.
It's beautiful.
By
6,000.
Walgreens, it's in trouble. Well, 6,000's been there for a long time, right? It's been needed. And then this winter, 5600 decided gravel is a good option, right? It's decided to fall apart. And so we have to budget how we fix. We're never gonna have enough money to do it. So, I don't know if you kept that. There was one more in there, but that's really kind of, as we talk to our funding balance, we're gonna recommend 3 months, which is 25%. We'll come back with policy.
That's kind of what we historically have tried to stay.
I'd like you to think through a lot of the challenge with capital projects is we have a lot of agreements that we have already inked and signed where we're supposed to pay back. Some of those are impact fees. Some of those say impact fees, but when you look at them, you cannot use impact fees on those projects. But they're an obligation of the city, and so we've tried to build them into the general fund.
Are they an obligation if they say impact and they're not impact fee?
Well, we were the ones who said what source of revenue we were paying. The person who spent it doesn't care what the revenue is. Although one of them, it said we would pay them once we collected a certain amount of impact fees, which we can't use impact fees for, but since we haven't collected, we'd only pay them what we collected, so.
They worked out the stormwater agreement.
I'm using it that way. It says, I might have to pay you with the stormwater general fund, but I'm only paying you what you brought in, even though there's not. We'll see how that flies. Some of the
They've been told.
No,
They
it's
were fine
hard
with it.
because we want to be,
That's the thing, we're being held to contracts and contracts say that.
And
we also want to be reasonable.
Ethical and reasonable.
that is the hard part is we're trying to build this budget is that it's not a blank slate or clean canvas, whatever metaphor I wanna use. We have pieces on there that we have to deal with. We need to build, so
So we need to be realistic
realistic.
about what we can provide.
So when I look at if we hold the positions out, it drops to about 1.2
Right.
on the
We're down to
shortfall.
1.1 because of the insurance.
1.1. A big chunk of next year is about $3 million for 7300 West.
And it needs to stay on there.
So let's talk about what that is. Is that an ongoing expense or is that a one-time project?
Well, the project's one time, but the ongoing is operating and maintenance.
So your ongoing, and so the 1.5 is in there for the ongoing, it needs to go up, I know that. But I would say if you choose to keep 7300 in there, which I think you need to, because we're talking about getting state money to extend it. I think you could make the argument that that's a one-time fund, and then in 2025, you have to step back and say, okay, what is happening? I think realistically, Jared, I'm gonna keep going this way, I think 6,000 sliding out a year,
Again.
at least. Stay on the plan, so it's still 3 years out,
So are.
it'll just be
It's the
3
same.
years out. We got Heritage done though.
True, I'm not cursing this place every time I leave.
But it's that, and somewhat, and I keep asking, and our engineers are great saying, no, we can do it. There's also a capacity of, can we do the project and do it in a good way that we're keeping the citizens in, or do we get too busy that we still get the project done, but we don't do it well? I'm not talking about the quality of the finished project, but we don't deliver the project to our citizens in a way that they find acceptable, right? So there's this piece, and that's the communication and how do we do it? 7300 is gonna involve buying some property, so we need to start negotiating. I think we've just started negotiating that. Thinking we're gonna build it probably next spring is the idea.
Yeah, well, you're talking about learning from the past, just like I've got lots of emails from the situation on Main Street, right? Upset people, and we're having to go through a legal process now because of, not necessarily all our fault, but I think we could have done a much better job of communicating so people understand, here's how the project is gonna impact you, here's why it's gonna impact you that way, and how can we help you, be good, just upfront, a little bit better with them.
And that's what I mean by the ultimate project delivery.
Yeah.
Is that we're running a project, trying to get it done, but we're running so fast, we don't have the capacity to step back and say, okay, I need to go meet with people now and give them an update. I'm just trying to keep my head above water and get it finished. There may be some of that, because we were trying to overlap those streets. Hey, we're finishing Main Street, we're gonna be buying property. Next year, we're supposed to be rebuilding 7300, we'll be buying all the property on 6000 West. I actually think that one's gonna be somewhat controversial as well, so we may wanna have a little bit more time between.
And I don't mean to overstep, obviously, this is your purview, on your side of the government, but I'm not opposed at all to saying, utilize me. I assume that you guys would be good with that too, if I need to hold some town halls to help people understand that better, to me,
I
it's
prefer
our
to,
role
if there's something
too.
like that going on in
Yeah,
my
I
district that people are gonna call me
utilize
for,
us.
like, tell
I
me
agree
ahead of
with that.
time so I can communicate with them.
And again, that's that staff time to say, okay, what is the best way to deliver this message? And sometimes it is. I've done a lot of town meetings in my career with the counselors whose project, especially when
Yeah.
you're taking or you're putting in a sidewalk in an area that's never had a sidewalk, but that means their landscaping's coming out, right? It's always been programmed to be, but I have this nice rose bush I put a few, and you're gonna tear up my rose. Yeah, we are.
That's where you're very key.
So it's this,
Yeah, for
it's
sure, I
how do
understand
you
there's some balance
do
there,
that project delivery?
but
that's
utilize
one of the
us if you
things-
need to, I'd
That's
say.
probably why they're saying, hey, if we had another staff engineer, we maybe,
Cause they got too many
Because of the-
projects on the table.
because of the budget, our recommendation is that we look at that CIP, probably bring it back to you, you can look at it and say, if we start sliding some projects, and then say, okay, well, does that give us time to let some of this work itself out.
It's so hard and frustrating, cause I understand what Jared's saying too, but the same with Man 7300, when you have people calling you always and you're like, this is the day, no, I promise, it's on the list, it's here, it's this, and then
So-
it's like, just kidding, it's sliding.
So what
You look
I
like
always-
You're always lying.
What I always try to tell people when you're using a capital plan is, if it's in the first 2 years, which is why I would advocate for doing 7200, it's going to be done. If it's in year 3, it's going to get done, but
those
it
2
may
years.
not be.
It might get done in the next
It,
5,
yes, right, cause it's in,
But
it's
it-
in
but
this little bit,
but it's there.
it's in an area where it's on it, but it may have to move, depend. If it's out on year 5, that's even a little bit, it's on our radar, we know we're going to do it at some point. And you'll see it, sometimes that'll move straight through, sometimes it lags, just because of the complexity or the cost. We actually have it projected out 10 years on some of these things, and I would say at 10 years, it's just a guess.
Realistically, that's okay because things happen, right? What I'm looking forward to with the people we have in place now is that we can be more realistic. I want a realistic starting place, right? And stop having Groundhog Day every year, which is, oh, well, here's all the excuses why nothing happened and why everything gets kicked down and now there's this new shiny thing that we wanna put over here. Like, I just hate that. I want an actual plan that's realistic for what we have to work with. And every year there will be 1 or 2 things that pop up, but we'll actually have a plan that's realistic we can follow. I think to this point, it's just been,
And I think if we went back to the budget practices, I probably tried to push us too fast this way and got some numbers, and I thought, this is great, let's plan it all, and we planned it, and those revenues, they're not
hopefully you're
realistic.
to the point where there's not any more significant surprises.
You found them all.
That's what I mean, realistic.
I am not making that commitment.
Because here's the thing, the way the budget's
Been here
been done
5 months,
before is
come on
what is, not to pick on the police, but I'll just say Alan and Brett and Gordon and company, it was always Rob and Peter to pay Paul, it was a shell game constantly. And we couldn't count on anything, we couldn't communicate anything to the residents because it wasn't real. That's at least the way I felt, as I looked at that list, I'm like, I'm not betting on any of those things getting done, because the second we say, yeah, we're good with this, next week they're gonna come in here and say, hey, there's this great new thing we gotta do, and we can't do any of this stuff because we wanna do this great thing, right? I mean, it was constantly. We've had 18 months now, well, almost 2 years for going through the forensic accounting to figure out what's what. There's still more to do, but at least I feel better, we're getting closer, and I'm trying to say this is the right approach, and not expecting perfection this year, but
Next year.
I'm just saying, let's be realistic.
July 1st.
Every time Kyle says, oh, I was spinning this, I just get like, no, we already had.
Because all
We
those
had two
graphs
surprises
should,
this week.
I should have
with
an email
baseline,
like,
we should be
you're
able to
overdoing it.
see that we're making progress instead of every year going, oh my gosh, well, this is something else we didn't know about, and now we're in the hole some more.
I hope that we are discovering a lot of these things, and we can come up to that plan, so you have, as a manager, I need to know what we're doing. Justin, Jonathan, Blake, whoever's doing the capital needs to be able to plan to something, because you can't just drop a big project and say, go rebuild 5600 West tomorrow. It's not gonna happen, right? You've gotta do all this planning, there's a whole lot, or 6,000, I should say, sorry, I'm not gonna do that one in front of them.
Well, you can even say the animal thing,
Yeah,
right? I mean, you take it from general fund, but that has the same effect,
Yeah.
right? Cause our target is 25% for all the reasons that we're talking about, so yep, we can dip into that, that's an emergency thing, right? That's kind of your
I
emergency
did leave
fund.
it in there.
Dip into the emergency fund, but that means it needs to be replaced next year, which means something doesn't happen.
Yeah, it's the same as our loan from another fund too, it's like, I'm sure that is gonna start impacting them. We gotta figure out how to replace that too.
So I say, I mean, there will be things like that that will pop up, but we have so many lingering issues from just the way things have been done. So the way that you've kind of listed this out, right? One time recurring structural, a lot of it's structural. You guys are doing a good job fixing some of that. To me, it's right sizing services is a big part of that. I think that's our job, is to tell you, yeah, we need to live within our means and let's be realistic about how many, I don't know, Easter egg hunts we can have and how, you know, how many street. But I just, whatever it is, in the past, I think we've done too much just cause they could at the time without looking at the effect on
Well, it's
next year.
because we utilize one-time money to do the fun stuff and to keep operating and it's
Right.
like.
Well, and you were in that danger zone.
Can I make a few comments?
Only
Oh,
two.
I didn't even know you're in the.
The voice that.
In the ceiling.
Okay, go ahead.
So, there's a part of me that just starts with a great big dramatic sigh as I think about all the problems that stem from, you know, past decisions that are made that kind of left us in this situation. I think there's a value in going through the process of how did we get here, right? Asking those questions I think is important. I think we need to be able to understand what mistakes were made so that we don't make the same mistakes again. We need to learn from those things and apply better decision making going forward. That being said, I don't see a lot of value in taking valuable time to work on these really important things by rehashing the same points we've been making at least for 3.5 years I've been on council and for time before that of the incompetence and the poor decision making and the surprise management style that was happening all the time. But I will, there's just nothing to be gained out of just throwing people under the bus for stuff at this point. But I will say, aspirationally, my hope that when we come out of this process, we're no longer managing from a standpoint of, oh, by the way, we forgot to tell you about this one agreement that we made 15 years ago, and all the plans that we've been making over the past 3 years now have to go out the window because we have to pay X, Y, and Z developer $7 billion next week.
That's
That kind of
exactly
stuff
what I'm
just
saying.
frankly pisses me off to no end. And I'm telling you, I'm a little hot about this conversation about the auto mall. I'm a little upset about this continued process of finding out stuff that's changing in our plans. Things that are getting added to the plans all the time. Why don't we have this stuff already in? So if we're going to go through this process and we're going to sit down and we're going to make these budgets, we damn well better have our stuff together in terms of what's on these plans, what's on this capital improvement plan, what's in these water plans, what's in the stormwater plans. And if we're making as a council important fiscal decisions based on this information, and then 3 months later you come back and tell us that information is wrong, that is just awful. And I'm frankly tired of being put in that position. It's been happening since, and it's nobody's fault here. It's a vestige of past decision making that have come into, you know, the current time that we're all having to deal with. But man, oh man, we cannot keep doing that. It is really, really unacceptable. I'm going to stop that rant for now. Let me get on this one more point that I think is more productive. Kyle, great job. I really appreciate you taking the time to get us going in the right direction. I use this phrase a lot, that making these changes is going to be a process, not an event. There's going to be a number of changes. Some are going to be really painful. They're going to be painful for us as a council because we're going to have votes on some really unpopular things. It's going to be painful for our residents because they're going to have increased costs. It's going to be painful for staff and for departments who are used to things going a different way, and now they're going to have to be a new way. And I guess I would just challenge everybody to keep this in mind, that we are not here to protect past loyalties to former managers or decisions that were made. We're not here to defend plans or decisions that were made by former councils. You've got 5 elected officials and a city manager are here now, and we're trying to do the best we can in the situation we are, and that might mean a radical departure from things we've done in the past, and you guys are gonna have to get on board with that and be comfortable with those radical changes. So, anyway, that's all I've got to say. I've got about 1,000 points, but we can put that off for when we get into it in the work meeting.
Well, we hope that you have some time to think it through. Now you've had this data download, think about it. We have time scheduled for next Wednesday. Just in our capital plan, that's one of the things we have included are the reimbursement agreements that we are aware of. I'm gonna couch it with that because it's been a while, but we've sat in some meetings even this year where it's like, oh, what about this agreement? Okay, so we have those in that plan. We're trying to figure out the realistic way to pay those off. So they are in there, and I frankly did not remove them when I showed you the capital. So we should be honoring our agreements. But you've had a lot of information. If there are specific questions that come up that you feel free to call us before Wednesday. You don't have to wait till Wednesday. Or if you need us to find some data, we would rather be able to go out and research and have the answer for you than instead of say, okay, let us go look for it. So feel free to call us, ask us those questions. Think about this, and I'm 5 minutes over my allotted time, so I want to be respectful of your time. But just feel free to call us and ask us the questions. And come with questions for next meeting, because the intent, like I said, this meeting was to give you all the information, let you think about it, come back with some ideas. So,
Public hearing.
well, just call and Travis is working on your request, hoping to have that Monday or Tuesday.
Can't we just come up with a formal letter that says, here's a list of all our reimbursement agreements, and here's our public notice, and if you have one that we're unaware of, you have X amount of time to notify us, if not, it's null and void.
I like that.
I would like that.
The attorney's like,
Oh my god, I could, come on, it sounds good to me. It's public.
there's a lot of things
Easy,
we
that
want,
would
but
be
we
really
can't do
helpful.
them.
Notice a public thing,
So you
Yeah,
just
you
say
take the
yes.
fun out of it.
we can
Oh,
say,
should I?
And
we
then
need all the
that'll
public
be-
notice.
You gotta make a motion.
Okay, look for a motion to adjourn.
To your
So
point,
moved.
I think
Yeah.
there should be some kind of, a policy that at least we adopt as a council formally that says, if you come to us 7 years after the fact demanding payment for something that you've never brought up and you've never discussed and you've never analyzed, you're just gonna go to the back of the line and we'll get to you as soon as we can. I mean, we can't have people dropping out of the sky saying, you owe me $3 million next week. We just can't do business that way. So if we're gonna budget out what we owe and get that all taken care of. If you come to us later and say we reimburse you, unless there's a specific clause that says we have to do it by a certain time.
I
you're at the
like
back of the
Teddy's
line.
idea earlier of the personal liability angle. Can we go after that?
Yeah.
So, within for at least the last year and going forward, council has to approve all reimbursement agreements, so we'll at least have record of what they are, and you'll have a chance to weigh in on those, so.
Okay, motion to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor?
Yeah,
Thank you, everybody.
Yes.
So I got.
No, Jared already made it. Or somebody already made it.
Yeah, I did.
Cool.